In the age before history had a name, before men drew borders on maps or raised temples to gods who no longer answered, the world was divided not by geography, but by power. There were those who could shift the shape of their flesh beneath a full moon, those who ran on four legs through primordial forests, who heard the heartbeat of the earth in the soles of their feet, the wolves. And then there were those who were something more, born not from any natural shifting of blood and bone, but from a pact struck between the moon goddess herself and two mortal brothers who dared to kneel before her light and ask for the strength to protect what they loved, the Lycans. Where wolves were powerful, Lycans were ancient. Where wolves were dangerous, Lycans were catastrophic. And where wolves had packs, families, communities, fragile alliances forged in survival. The Lycan kings had an empire, but power, no matter how vast, cannot outrun fate. And fate, on the night our story begins, had chosen a girl scrubbing blood from a stone floor to reshape the entire world. Her name was Alina, and she had no idea what she was. Before we begin, if you love dark Lycan kings, forbidden mates, and stories that make your heart ache, comment where you are watching from and subscribe for epic Lycan King romances, where Omegas rise, kings fall, and love is never gentle. The Omega nobody saw, the bonfires of Midnight Ridge burned so high that night that the smoke could be seen from 3 valleys away. Warriors sang in voices still hoarse from battle. Silver goblets were filled and drained and filled again. For the great hall of the pack had been stripped of its mourning banners and dressed in the crimson and black of victory. Though victory, as it always does, wore a complicated face. Some of those celebrating had lost brothers. Some had lost sons. One elder in the corner hadn't spoken since the battle 3 days ago, his eyes fixed on the flames as though he could see the dead still walking there. But the pack was alive. That was what mattered. The northern clans had been pushed back beyond the Iron Mountains, and Midnight Ridge stood. Among the celebration, moving like a ghost through living people, was a girl. She was young, somewhere between a girl and a woman. That liminal age when the world is deciding what kind of creature you will become. Her hair was long and black as a raven feathers, twisted into a rough braid that had been secured 3 times with strips of cloth because she'd never had ribbons. Her dress was gray, or perhaps it had once been another color, long ago before years of washing other people's blood from it had stripped it down to this pale, exhausted shade. She moved through the celebration with her eyes down and a wooden bucket in her hands, wiping spilled mead from the flagstones before it could attract flies. Wolves passed her without a glance. A warrior stepped backward into her path without looking, nearly upending the bucket, and then turned and shoved his empty goblet at her without a word. "More wine." She took the goblet. She poured the wine. She handed it back. He had already turned away. This was Alina's world. While she had lived in Midnight Ridge for 9 years, since the night the Alpha's men had appeared at the edge of her family's territory and informed her at 8 years old that her parents were dead and that the Alpha would be generous enough to take her in. She had never been told how they died. She had stopped asking around the time she was 10, when she realized that asking made people angry, and anger in a wolf pack had consequences. Her stepbrother Darius had made sure she understood her place from the very beginning. He was the Alpha's nephew, broad, handsome in the careless way that men with power often are, and absolutely convinced that cruelty passed off as honesty was a virtue. "You're lucky we took you in at all. An orphan Omega with no pack, no lineage, no wolf worth mentioning. Do you know what rogues do to girls like you who wander alone?" She did know. He'd made sure of that too. So Alina worked. She cleaned and carried and cooked and hauled. She made herself small and useful and invisible, because invisible things don't get hurt. She had learned that lesson so thoroughly it had become instinct, the way a prey animal learns to freeze when shadows move overhead. She scrubbed blood from the stone floor of the great hall, listening to the wolves around her laugh and drink and recount their victories, and she was invisible to all of them. Until the night everything changed. It began, as most catastrophic things do, with a whispered conversation in a room she wasn't supposed to hear. The price of war. The victory was real, but the cost was catastrophic. 3 moons of sustained warfare had stripped Midnight Ridge down to the bone. Their eastern granaries had been burned in the 3rd week. Their silver mines, the pack's primary source of wealth and their greatest military advantage, had been flooded deliberately by the northern clans in a final act of spite before their retreat. 7 of their 12 border territories were uninhabitable, scorched earth and collapsed fortifications, stretching for miles along what used to be their most prosperous lands. And the debts. War never came without creditors. The weapons had to be bought. The healers had to be paid. The mercenary wolves who'd bolstered their numbers in the 2nd moon of fighting, when Midnight Ridge's own pack had been stretched too thin, had charged rates that would have been obscene even in peacetime. The elders gathered in the War Council chamber 3 nights after the victory celebration. Alina was not supposed to be in the adjoining corridor. She had been delivering clean linens to the upper chambers and made the mistake of taking the short route. She heard them before she saw anything. The low, urgent voices of men deciding things that would affect people who would never be asked for their opinion. She should have kept walking. She knew that even as she slowed, pressing herself against the cold stone wall just outside the cracked door, barely breathing, the voices drifted through. The Northern tribute is not optional. The Lycan Kings have made that very clear. Payment must be rendered before the next full moon, or the Empire withdraws its protection entirely. Protection? Someone laughed bitterly. Oh, protection we cannot afford any less than we could afford this war. We don't have the gold. They don't want gold. Silence. The Lycan Kings have a custom. The Northern packs know it. When tribute cannot be rendered in material wealth, it can be rendered in... A pause. A throat cleared uncomfortably. Alternatives. Another silence. Longer this time. Then in a voice she recognized instantly. A voice like smooth river ice, pleasant until you stepped on it and plunged through. Darius. I know exactly what to give them. The linen slipped from Alina's arms. She caught them before they hit the floor, her heart slamming against her ribs so hard she was certain they could hear it through the wall. She didn't wait to hear more. She should have run. Instead, she retreated quietly, folded the linens over her arm, and carried them up to the chambers as though she'd heard nothing at all. That night, alone in her small room at the back of the servants' wing, she lay awake listening to the wind scrape branches against the shuttered window, and told herself she was imagining things. She was still telling herself that when the guards came for her 2 mornings later, sold to the monsters, they came at dawn. She was in the kitchen. She was always in the kitchen at dawn, starting the fires, hauling water, beginning the long, invisible labor of keeping 200 wolves fed. The sound of boots on stone reached her before the guards did, which gave her approximately 3 seconds to feel the specific quality of dread that comes when you have been expecting something terrible, and it finally arrives. There were 4 of them. Pack guards in full armor, which was unusual for an interior summons. Their faces were arranged in the careful blankness of men who'd been told exactly what they were doing and had decided not to think about it too hard. The captain, she knew him, had served him 100 meals, knew he preferred his bread with honey, looked at a fixed point just above her head, and said, "Alina, you're to come with us." She set down the water she was carrying, deliberately, carefully, as if setting it down gently might somehow keep the world from tilting. Where? The Alpha's hall. She went. The great hall looked different in morning light. The victory decorations were still up, but they looked garish now, out of context. Crimson and black paper flowers and painted banners that seemed to mock the solemnity of the men and women assembled inside. Yes, the elders were there, most of the senior warriors, a dozen pack members who served as witnesses for formal pack proceedings, and Darius, standing at the Alpha's right hand, smiling. It was the smile that told her everything. She had seen that smile on his face 100 times over 9 years. The particular satisfaction of a man who has arranged something to his advantage and is enjoying the moment before the person being arranged finds out about it. The Alpha was speaking. She heard the words. They arrived in the wrong order somehow, failing to assemble themselves into sense until they suddenly, catastrophically, did. Tribute to the Northern Empire. The Lycan Kings have been generous in defining what constitutes acceptable payment. In the interest of the pack's survival, an Omega girl, unclaimed, of minimal pack value. 9 years of work rendered in those 3 words. She looked at Darius. He met her eyes for the first time and she couldn't remember how long, and she saw it there. Not regret, not even guilt. Just that smile, just a little wider now that she understood. You're finally useful, sister. She turned to the elders, to the warriors, to the faces she had served and cleaned for and cooked for and moved silently around for 9 years. Not one of them would meet her eyes. No, she said, and then because that one word seemed entirely insufficient. No, you can't. I have rights. Every pack member has rights under the Moon Covenant. You can't simply... You're not a full pack member. Darius's voice was gentle, almost kind, in the way that a sharpened knife can look almost harmless before it cuts. You've never been formally claimed. You have no wolf of standing. You are, legally speaking, a ward of the pack, and wards can be transferred. She looked at the Alpha. He was an old man, and his face was the face of someone who had made a very difficult decision and had decided the difficulty of it excused him from feeling too badly about it. It is for the good of the pack, he said quietly. I am sorry, child. She didn't cry. She had cried a great deal in her first years at Midnight Ridge, alone in her small room, quiet so no one would hear. She had run out of those particular tears somewhere around her 12th year. What was left now was something harder, something that had been compressed under 9 years of weight into something small and dense and very nearly unbreakable. She let them bind her wrists. She walked between the guards with her chin raised and her eyes dry, and her heart doing something complicated inside her chest that had no name yet, but would later turn out to be the first trembling stirring of the thing that had always been inside her. She was put in a carriage that same evening. No goodbyes. No one came. The gates of Midnight Ridge closed behind her, and the pack, the only home she had ever known, inadequate and cruel as it had been, disappeared into the darkness behind the carriage wheels. The journey north, 3 days. 3 days of roads that deteriorated from packed earth to gravel to something barely distinguishable from wilderness. 3 days of watching the landscape change outside the small barred window of the carriage, the familiar pine-dark forests of the south giving way to something older and stranger, trees so ancient their trunks were wider than the carriage itself, their branches interlocking overhead to form a canopy so dense it turned midday into perpetual twilight. The escort wolves barely spoke to her. Food was handed through the window twice daily, bread and dried meat and a water skin. She was let out to walk for an hour each afternoon, chained to a guard's wrist like a recalcitrant dog. She used those hours to observe. This far north, the air itself was different, heavier. There was something in it that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. Not cold exactly, though it was cold, but something else. A pressure, a presence. As if the land itself was aware of her and was considering whether she was worth paying attention to. On the morning of the 3rd day, they came through a mountain pass, and the world opened out below them. Alina had never seen anything built on that scale. The Lycan fortress rose from the northern plateau like something that had simply decided to be a mountain and then changed its mind halfway. Black stone, not the dark gray of ordinary rock, but true black, volcanic glass threaded through with veins of deep crimson that caught the weak winter light and threw it back in shards. Towers that rose so high their peaks were lost in the permanent low clouds. Walls so thick that the packed soldiers she could see on the battlements looked like children playing at a toy fort. Red banners, hundreds of them, waists snapping in a wind that seemed to blow from all directions at once. The banners bore the Lycan crest, a full moon bisected by 2 wolves, back to back, facing outward. 2 wolves, the twin kings. "Move," said the guard at her wrist and tugged the chain. The gates opened for them without ceremony. They had been expected. Inside, the scale was somehow even more overwhelming. A courtyard large enough to muster an army. Statues of wolves mid-shift, carved in that same black stone, lining a central avenue that led toward the main keep. Everything was precise and permanent and utterly without softness. The carriage stopped. The door opened. Elena stepped down into the Northern Empire's seat of power, her wrists still bound, her dress still gray, her braid coming undone on one side from 3 days of sleeping, sitting up, and felt, for just a moment, the most profound sense of smallness she had ever experienced. Then she heard footsteps. They came from the direction of the keep, unhurried, deliberate, the footsteps of men who had never had any reason to move quickly because the world has always waited for them. Two sets of footsteps, perfectly synchronized in the way that only people who have walked beside each other for their entire lives manage. She made herself look up. They were identical, not merely as twins often are, similar, rhyming, echoes of each other. These two men were identical in a way that felt almost supernatural, as though the moon goddess had created a template and stamped it twice. Both tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet their gaze. Both broad across the shoulders with the kind of muscle that came from decades of actual work, rather than decorative training. Both dark-haired, their hair falling across foreheads so sharply cut they might have been carved. Both with eyes that caught the thin northern light and threw it back wrong. Too bright, too still, the eyes of creatures that had been watching the world for a very long time and had learned to see everything. The one on the left wore his authority like weather. Vast, ambient, impossible to argue with. He moved with the ease of someone who has never once in his adult life wondered whether he was welcome in a room. The one on the right had a particular quality of stillness about him, the way very sharp blades are still when they are not being used. Kyle and Caden, the Lycan Kings, they stopped 10 feet from her. But she was very aware suddenly of the state of her dress, of the rope binding her wrists. She raised her chin anyway. Kyle, she would learn later which was which, but she somehow already knew, tilted his head slightly. His nostrils flared. Something shifted in his expression. Something that had been merely watchful became suddenly intensely focused. Beside him, his brother went absolutely still. The guards who had escorted her from Midnight Ridge were backing away. She could hear them retreating without looking. The scuff of boots on stone, a muttered prayer, the particular sound of people removing themselves from a situation they didn't understand but recognized as significant. Kyle's eyes locked onto hers and something happened. It was not a sound exactly, more like the moment before a sound, the held breath before thunder, to the tension in the air before lightning decides to fall. It moved through her from the outside in, from her skin to her bones to something below her bones, something she had always thought was simply the absence of a real wolf, the hollow space where her omega nature lived, quiet and small and deliberately unobtrusive. That hollow space suddenly felt very full. A low sound escaped Kale's throat, a sound she had no frame of reference for. Not a growl, not quite, but something older than growling, something that belonged to a time before language and its limitations. His brother's eyes went wide. "Impossible," Caden said very quietly. And then both men spoke, in voices layered with something that vibrated at a frequency she felt in her back teeth. Mate. The weight of a word. She had heard the word before, where every wolf knew what a mate was. It was the great organizing principle of their world. The idea that the moon goddess, if she was feeling generous, would align two souls with enough precision that when they found each other, they would know. Not hope, not suspect. Know in a way that lived in the bones and the blood, and the particular electricity of a first breath of someone else's scent. She had always assumed it would never happen to her. Omegas could have mates. The Moon Covenant said so, and the Moon Covenant was as close to sacred law as their kind had. But in practice, the weakest wolves almost never found theirs. Or if they did, those with more power found reasons for the bond to be overlooked, redirected, declared null. The world was practical in that particular cruelty. She had never imagined the word would be spoken by two kings simultaneously while looking at her. She began. Cal was in front of her before she'd finished the syllable, not moving quickly, or rather moving so quickly that the transition between standing 10 feet away and standing directly before her simply didn't register as motion. He was one place, and then he was another place, and she had lost the moment in between. He was very close, close enough that she could smell him, cedar and dark earth and something electric, something that reminded her of the air before a storm breaks. The scent of him did something unreasonable to the hollow space inside her. He lifted her bound wrists. His hands were large, careful, extraordinarily gentle for hands that could clearly have destroyed things very easily. And he looked at the rope binding her. His jaw tightened. Who bound her? The escort captain, the one she'd served 100 meals, the one who preferred honey, actually took a step backward. She was transported as tribute, Your Majesty. Protocol. Remove it. It wasn't a loud command. It wasn't a threatening one. It had the same quality as an earthquake. Not angry, just inevitable. The rope was cut within seconds. Alina rubbed her wrists. The skin was raw underneath. Cale watched this, and something in his face went very, very still, in a way that she would later understand meant he was containing something. Caden had come to stand beside his brother. Up close, she could see the differences. Subtle things she wouldn't have noticed at a distance. Caden's mouth was set in a slightly softer line. His eyes had that same impossible brightness, held something that looked almost like wonder. You are our mate, he said. Not a question. Confirmation, spoken with the careful precision of a man making sure he understood something correctly before acting on it. She stopped. Started again. I'm an Omega, from Midnight Ridge. I was sent as tribute because my pack couldn't pay their war debts in any other currency. She said it flatly, deliberately, because she had found that removing emotion from humiliating things made them smaller, made them merely factual. Kyle's eyes darkened. Sent as tribute. He repeated the words as if testing whether they could possibly mean what they seemed to mean. They bound you and put you in a carriage and sent you north. Yes. Something passed between the two brothers. Not words, not even a glance. But just a shift in the air that she would later understand was a full conversation conducted in the language of shared blood and 3 decades of existing in the same space. You are not tribute, Cal said finally. You are ours, and no one will speak of it otherwise. That's very... She was aware she sounded strange. She felt strange. The hollow space inside her was doing something she had no vocabulary for, warm and insistent and slightly frightening. Very generous, but I don't understand. You don't need to understand it yet, Caden said gently. You need to eat and rest and warm yourself. The rest can be explained slowly. It was such a reasonable thing to say that it momentarily derailed all her carefully maintained defenses. She let them lead her inside. She would think later that this was the last moment of her old life, and the last breath of the girl who had been invisible. After this, nothing would ever be small again. The mark. The rooms they gave her were larger than any space she had ever occupied alone. Stone walls softened with tapestries woven in deep jewel tones. Sapphire and crimson and forest green. Scenes of wolves running through moonlit fields. Of great battles. Of a woman with silver hair standing at the center of a circle of fire while wolves bowed around her. A fire burned in a hearth large enough to stand inside. The bed was built for something closer to a giant than a human, covered in furs so thick she could lose her hand in them to the wrist. A woman, older, with gray at her temples and the contained efficiency of someone who has served powerful people long enough to find it unremarkable, brought food and fresh clothes and said nothing beyond what was necessary. Alina ate, changed, sat by the fire. Her mind refused to be still. Mate. The word turned and turned in her thoughts, and she couldn't decide what to do with it. She had no framework for this. She had spent 9 years becoming invisible, becoming manageable, becoming the version of herself that required the least from anyone around her. And now two of the most powerful creatures in the known world had looked at her and said a word that meant, in every tradition and teaching and story she had ever encountered, "You are the center of something." She didn't know how to be the center of anything. The knock at her door was very quiet, for men who could have knocked it off its hinges without noticing. "May we enter?" She had not expected to be asked. "Yes." They came in together, as she was beginning to understand they always did, moving in that unconscious synchrony that wasn't coordination, but simply shared instinct. They sat where she indicated without any of the territorial posturing she would have expected from alphas in any other context. They explained, the mate bond for Lycans was different from the connection between ordinary wolves. Older, more absolute. When a Lycan found their mate, and many Lycans lived for centuries and never did, the bond being so rare it bordered on mythological, the recognition was complete and irreversible, not gradual, not conditional, not dependent on whether the mate in question was considered worthy by anyone else's estimation. "Our father never found his," Cal said, "nor his father before him. We were told it was possible we never would." "We stopped expecting it," Caden added quietly, "a long time ago." "And then you—" Kyle stopped. He had a habit, she was noticing, of stopping just before the thing he most wanted to say, as if the size of it required more space than a single sentence could hold. He reached across instead. His hand hovered an inch above hers, waiting. She placed her hand in his. The sensation was immediate and extraordinary. A surge of warmth that began where their skin met and moved upward through her arm, her shoulder, her chest, reaching the hollow space inside her that had always been cold and quiet and small. And the hollow space didn't feel hollow anymore. It felt like a door blown open by a gale, and behind the door was not emptiness, but light. She gasped. Kel's grip tightened, steadying, and his eyes, those impossible, too bright eyes, met hers with an expression she had never before seen directed at herself. Wonder. That night, under the full moon that poured silver through the tall windows of the northern fortress, the twin kings marked their mate. She had known about marking. Every wolf child knew. The sacred bite, the claiming, the seal of a bond between mated wolves. But the reality of it was nothing like she had imagined. It didn't hurt. Or rather, it hurt the way light hurts when you've been in darkness so long you've forgotten it exists. An overload of something real and true, too much and exactly right at the same time. 2 bites, one from each of them. 2 burning points of heat against her collarbone, perfectly placed, perfectly mirrored. 2 marks. And through the marks, for just a moment, she felt them. Both of them, their emotions as clear as her own. Kyle's fierce, almost overwhelming certainty. Caden's profound, quiet joy. She had been invisible her entire life. In that moment, she was the most seen she had ever been. She slept that night for the first time in 9 years, completely unafraid. What morning takes? She woke to sunlight, not the gray-filtered dawn she was accustomed to in the servants' wing at Midnight Ridge, where the single high window looked north and caught maybe an hour of direct light in winter. Real sunlight flooding through tall glass panes, laying itself across the fur covers in long gold stripes. She lay still for a moment, simply experiencing this. Then she reached for her collarbone. Her fingers found smooth skin. She sat up. She pulled the neckline of the sleep robe aside, angling herself toward the nearest mirror. Nothing. No marks, no red, no bruising, no trace of the burning press of lips and teeth that she had been so certain, so deeply certain, she had felt. The skin of her collarbone was as unmarked as a child's. She sat absolutely still for 3 seconds. Then she pressed her hand flat against the place where the mark should have been and called internally. The way wolves called to their bond when they needed to feel the connection, and felt nothing. The hollow space was hollow again. She was still sitting like that, one hand pressed to her collarbone, when she heard the commotion. Why, it began at the far end of the fortress and moved toward her like weather moving across open water. Raised voices, running footsteps, the particular acoustic quality of an institution discovering a crisis. By the time the sounds reached her corridor, she was dressed and standing at her door. She opened it. In the corridor outside, two guards were exchanging rapid words in lowered voices that failed to be as quiet as they intended. She caught fragments. Marks, both of them, but the bond, counsel is furious. Doesn't make sense. She should be saying the bond rejected. She closed the door quietly, stood in the center of the room, breathed. Something was wrong with the bond. The marks hadn't held. Whatever had happened last night, whatever that extraordinary, overwhelming, real as anything experience had been, had apparently not registered in whatever way the Lycan court considered official. She was intelligent enough to understand what this meant even before the summons came, even before she stood before the council and saw their faces. The calculation and relief and discomfort of people who had identified a problem and were deciding how to manage it. Even before one of the council elders, old, gray-furred at the temples, wearing the expression of a man delivering a verdict he finds personally distasteful but politically necessary, spoke the words that formally changed her status from mate to complication. The bond has not manifested correctly. The marks have vanished. This is without precedent in recorded Lycan history, and the council is compelled to investigate whether the connection was a false reading. In the interim, the girl will be housed as a guest of the crown while she stopped listening after guest of the crown. Guest, not mate, guest. A polite word that, in context, meant something very specific. The kind of guest who is held at careful distance while the people with power figure out what to do with them. She looked at Kyle and Caden, who stood to one side of the council chamber. Kale's face was a controlled storm. Caden's jaw was set in a hard line. They were both contained in the way of men who are accustomed to power and are currently having to restrain themselves from using it. They met her eyes, and she saw clearly that they believed her, that they believed last night, that the bond, whatever the marks said or didn't say, it was real to them. But belief in the political architecture of an empire was a fragile thing without evidence to support it. Seraphine. Her name arrived before she did. Alina heard it first from the woman who brought her meals. Not cruelly, just factually, in the offhand way that palace servants drop information without realizing they're doing it. Lady Seraphine is expected this afternoon. The kings will receive her formally. Who is she? A pause. Highborn daughter of the Eastern Alliance. She has long been considered a potential political match for the kings. Before the woman stopped herself. She has been considered. Alina ate her breakfast and said nothing. She saw Seraphine for the first time from a window overlooking the main courtyard. A tall woman, willowy, who moved with the polished elegance of someone trained from childhood to be precisely this impressive. Her hair was honey gold, elaborately dressed. Her clothes were the kind that required assistance to put on. Her face, even at this distance, was beautiful in the sharp, symmetrical way of a painted miniature. She arrived with a retinue of 40. By that evening, Alina had been quietly moved to smaller rooms. She told herself this was fine. It was a political reality. The kings had an empire to run and a council to manage, and bonds that didn't manifest correctly were, legitimately, a problem. She told herself this with great thoroughness as she ate dinner alone and listened to the sounds of a formal welcome feast drifting up through the stones beneath her feet. 3 days later, Seraphine came to find her. Alina was at her window when the door opened without a knock. She turned. Up close, Seraphine was even more striking. She was also, Alina realized immediately, very intelligent. The beauty was almost a misdirection, an interesting surface that people spent so much time regarding that they forgot to look for what was behind it. What was behind it, Alina thought, was careful and ambitious and quite capable of waiting. "You're the Omega from Midnight Ridge," Seraphine said. Not a question. Assessment. "Yes. They felt something when you arrived. I've been told." Something was one way of putting it. "Yes." Seraphine's gaze moved over her. Not the appraisal of someone who found her threatening, which was more unsettling than the alternative. the appraisal of someone who found her manageable. The bond didn't manifest. The council is inclined to consider it a misreading. You'll be sent back to your pack within the fortnight. She said it without cruelty, almost gently, which made it, in its way, worse. Elena looked at her and said nothing. I'm telling you this, Seraphine continued, because I think it's better if you understand the situation clearly, rather than invest hope in something that won't develop the way you're imagining. I appreciate the honesty, Elena said, and meant it, and also understood that every word of this conversation was strategic. Seraphine left. 3 days after that, she appeared in the Great Hall wearing a mark on her collarbone, a single burn mark, precisely shaped, in the same spot where Elena's had been. She declared with beautiful, perfect composure that the moon goddess had blessed her union with the Lycan Kings. Watched that the bond had manifested, that she was their fated mate. The council erupted with relief, the kind of relief that meant they had wanted this answer and were willing to take it without asking too many questions about where it had come from. Elena stood at the back of the hall and watched and thought about marks that appeared 3 days after the relevant full moon, and about a woman who had arrived with 40 retinue members and might, among them, have had a very skilled practitioner of the old magic. Might. She had no proof. She had only the cold certainty of someone who had felt something real and was watching it be replaced with something false, and the equally cold certainty that no one in this room was going to take the word of an Omega from a disgraced Southern pack over the word of a highborn daughter of the Eastern Alliance. She left quietly. No one noticed her go. The accusation. They came for her the next morning. Not guards this time. Seraphine's women. 3 of them, poised and cold, wearing the new Luna's colors. Lady Seraphine requests your presence. She went. The room where Seraphine received her was different from the functional spaces Elena had occupied. It had been transformed in 72 hours from a state guest room to something that announced its occupants' intentions in every detail. Rich drapes, flowers everywhere, furniture rearranged to create sight lines that centered Seraphine wherever she sat, regardless of where the visitor stood. She was very good at this. I wanted to give you an opportunity to leave gracefully, Seraphine said without preamble, before the council formalizes the situation. Formalizes? Your presence here is becoming complicated. There are those who remember what happened when you arrived, who might, out of misguided sympathy, encourage you to make claims that would disrupt the stability of a critical political moment. And if I did make such claims, Seraphine's expression didn't change, then I would be forced to present the council with the interpretation that makes the most sense given the available evidence. That a rogue Omega, sold as tribute, attempted to deceive the Lycan Kings regarding a false bond claim. That the deception was discovered. That the true bond manifested correctly to the right person. Elena looked at her for a long time. You stole it, she said finally. Whatever you used, whatever practitioner you found, you fabricated that mark. Seraphine said nothing. But you can't fabricate the actual bond. You know that. You might have the mark, you might have the council's blessing, but when the kings are near you, the kings, Seraphine said carefully, are practical men. They understand that Lycan mates are rare to the point of myth. They understand that what they felt when you arrived may have been a proximity effect, a resonance from the bond actually meant for me, displaced by your arrival. The council's scholars have provided a very thorough explanation. And the kings believe it? A pause, brief but real. They will, because the alternative, that their true mate is an unclaimed Omega from a disgraced Southern pack, spirited away and unable to provide any evidence of her claim, is not an alternative they can afford. Not politically, not practically. Elena stood very still. And if I refuse to leave, then I'll have you removed, not cruelly. I'm not interested in cruelty, but you will leave this fortress. You will return to Midnight Ridge. And in 10 years' time, this will all be a story you tell differently. She left that room having made no promises, but she left knowing she would be gone within days regardless. Because Seraphine was right about one thing. She had no evidence. She had no standing. She had no wolf of rank or power. She was an omega from a disgraced pack, and I felt a bond that left no mark was not an argument that would survive contact with Lycan imperial politics. She went back to her room and began to think about what came next. The banishment Kale found her first. She was packing, which didn't take long because she had arrived with nothing and had been given only the practical. Clothing, a traveling cloak, the small things that made up a guest's necessities. She was rolling the cloak when the door opened. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking at her. His face was doing something complicated. "You're leaving." "I'm being removed." "There's a difference." He crossed the room. She kept her hands busy with the cloak because doing something with her hands was better than standing still and having her face tell him things. "We know it was real," he said. "Caden and I both felt it. We feel it still. But the council, I know. Alina, I know," she said again, more quietly. "I understand the position you're in. I genuinely do. I don't blame you." This was mostly true. There was a part of her, the part that had felt the bond, that had slept without fear for one night, that had experienced what it was like to be truly seen, that blamed him for everything. But that part was not the dominant part, and she had long practice at making sure it didn't run her decisions. "It's not right," he said. The words came out stripped of all the kingship and the authority and the controlled power. Just a man speaking something true. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." Caden appeared in the doorway. One look at both of them told him everything. He came to stand beside his brother, and for a moment they were all three just still together, in this room with its too large bed and its fire and its high windows. And she tried to commit it to memory because she suspected this was the last time. "We will find a way," Caden said. "I know you believe that. We mean it." She finished rolling the cloak, tucked it under her arm, looked at both of them for one long moment. "Don't," she said finally, and meant it as kindness. "Don't make promises you can't keep to someone who has no choice but to leave. It's crueler than just letting it be what it is." She left. She didn't look back. She was very careful not to look back. The long road. She was given a horse and a guide to the southern border of the Empire's territory and then left to her own navigating. It was, she supposed, better than the carriage ride north. She rode through the ancient forest alone, and for the first day she kept everything carefully surface level in her mind. Practical things, root things. Where to find water, whether the clouds moving in from the northwest meant rain. She was good at keeping things surface level. She had years of practice. On the second day, riding through a valley so old and silent, it felt like riding through someone else's memory. She let herself feel it. The hollow space was wrong now. It was still hollow. The marks were gone. The bond was severed or denied or whatever had happened. But it wasn't the clean, quiet hollow of before. It was the hollow of something that had been there and had been removed. A tooth socket hollow. The kind that you can't help pressing your tongue against over and over, even knowing it will hurt. She felt the loss of it with the same thoroughness she had felt the bond itself. Total, comprehensive, unavoidable. She also, somewhere around the second evening's campfire, began to feel something else. Anger. Not the small, careful anger of a girl who knows better than to show it. Something larger. Something that had apparently been building for 9 years, and a false mate bond, and one night of knowing what it was to not be invisible, and had decided finally that it was done being stored. She had been traded as tribute. She had been used as political furniture. She had been told her entire life that she was minimal, marginal, that her wolf was too weak to matter, her standing too low to count, her presence so negligible that she could be handed away like a debt payment. And she had believed it. Not entirely, not in the deep places. But enough. Enough to be obedient. Enough to be manageable. Enough to make herself small enough to fit into the space that kept being assigned to her. She sat beside her campfire in the ancient forest and was angry, and it felt like breathing for the first time. That was when her wolf, dormant and small and supposedly negligible for her entire life, did something it had never done before. It stirred, not gently, the truth about her parents. She had not intended to return to Midnight Ridge. Her vague plan, to the extent that she had one, was to continue south until she found a settlement, perhaps offer her labor for food and accommodation, and figure out next steps from there. But her wolf had other ideas. The stirring intensified over 3 days of travel, growing from a faint warmth at the base of her chest to something more insistent, more directional. It pulled south and east, toward the ridge. She tried to ignore it. She had been ignoring her wolf's small signals her entire life, or what she'd thought were small signals. She was beginning to revise that assumption. On the 4th day, she stopped fighting and let it lead. Midnight Ridge was different approaching from the north. She'd never approached it from the north before, had never in 9 years left the pack's immediate territory at all. Seen from this angle, from higher ground, it looked smaller than it did from inside. The stone walls, the banners, the Great Hall's towers, all of it sized down to something manageable. She came through the tree line at dusk. When the border guard saw her in the very specific blankness of his expression, the studied nothing to see here of a man who has been told what to do if a particular situation arises, told her they had been informed to watch for her. He reached for the warning bell. She was faster. She didn't understand what she'd done exactly until it was over. The guard was on his knees in the snow, staring up at her with an expression of complete bewilderment, his hand still reaching for the bell that was somehow 3 feet to the left of where it should be. She stood over him and felt the warmth in her chest blazing now, not uncomfortable but intense, like standing too close to a forge. "Where is Darius?" she asked. Her voice came out different, lower, more even. She noticed this distantly. The guard told her. Darius was in the pack archives. She found him there, alone, which was fortunate, bent over a document he tried to cover when he heard her step. She let him cover it. She knew what it was, or she thought she did, and she was wrong, but not in the way she expected, because the document he was covering was not about her. It was about her parents. She could read upside down. Another skill learned invisibly over 9 years of moving through spaces where people didn't think to guard what they left visible. The document was a transfer of ownership, of territory, of resources, of the specific designation of a particular bloodline's claim. Her parents' bloodline. Her father had been alpha of a small territory on the southern edge of what was now Midnight Ridge's land. Her mother had been his mate, his equal, not merely his Luna, but a wolf of considerable power in her own right. She had known none of this. She had been 8. She had been told accident. She had stopped asking. Darius's name was on the document, his father's name above it, and the date. The date was 3 days before her parents' deaths. Not an accident, not a raid, not bad luck in dangerous territory. Murder for land. Premeditated, documented in the cold language of resource acquisition, filed away in an archive she would never have found if her wolf hadn't led her back here. She looked up from the document. Darius had backed against the far wall. He was fast and strong and dangerous, and he knew it. But he was also, she could see, genuinely frightened. She understood why a moment later, when she caught her own reflection in the dark glass of the archive window. Her eyes were silver, completely, fully. No iris, no white, pure silver light, like 2 moons caught in a human face. She had heard stories, old stories, the kind that got told less and less as the generations passed. Stories about what happened when an alpha bloodline was suppressed for long enough, kept small enough, threatened enough, starved of the recognition that would have let it grow, and then finally was given enough reason to be done with small. The wolf doesn't forget its blood, the story said. It just waits. The alpha rises. She called the pack meeting in the traditional way. A howl sent from the top of the ridge at precisely the right pitch and frequency that every wolf in the territory would hear it in both their human and wolf ears simultaneously. A challenge howl, a claiming howl. Oh, the kind that hasn't been heard in a generation because most wolves understand that you don't send one unless you mean to back it up completely. She meant to back it up completely. They came because wolf instinct doesn't ask permission before it responds to challenge calls. They came confused, some of them still eating dinner, some in half-shift states of alarm. They assembled in the great clearing outside the hall, and when they saw who had called them, the murmuring started. Alina, the Omega Maid, standing at the center of the clearing like she'd been standing there all her life, wearing clothes still dusty from travel, with silver eyes and a wolf's presence so dense and heavy that the air around her was doing something to the wolves' instincts that they didn't have words for, making them want to lower their heads. Darius came last. He had composed himself during the time it took the pack to assemble. He was flanked by 4 warriors, which was either confidence or the admission that he wasn't sure how confident he should be. He looked at her for a long moment. "An Omega challenging for Alpha rank," he said, loud enough for the assembled pack to hear. "This is either very brave or very stupid." "Which one it is," she said, "depends on what kind of wolf I actually am. You're an Omega. You've always been an Omega. I've always been treated like one. Those are different things." He shifted. The change moved through him like a wave, smooth and practiced. He'd been shifting for 20 years, and it showed. The wolf that emerged was large, dark-furred, powerful. He was, she acknowledged privately, genuinely formidable. In any other circumstances, against any other wolf, this would not be a fair fight. She shifted. Hers was not smooth. It was not practiced. It was the first true shift of a wolf that had spent 9 years compressed into something much smaller than it was supposed to be, and it came with the kind of force that made the assembled pack take a collective step backward. The silver wolf that stood in the clearing where Alina had been was enormous. Not merely large the way Darius was large, enormous in a way that belonged to a different category entirely. Massive shoulders, a mane of silver-white fur that caught the moonlight and turned it back into something colder and brighter. Eyes that blazed with that same silver light, and a presence, an alpha's presence. 9 years of suppression releasing all at once, crashing over the assembled pack like a wave. Wolves began to lower their heads. Not from strategy, not from politics, from pure instinct responding to something that ranked above every instinct they had. Darius held. She had to respect that. She would have in any other context. He held himself in the face of something that his every wolf instinct was screaming was categorically above him, and he threw himself at her anyway. The fight lasted less than 40 seconds. She didn't destroy him. She could have. She made the choice not to, which was its own kind of power. The restraint of something that could crush and chooses to contain instead. Darius lay in the snow of the clearing, wolf form but prone. Every line of his body the submission posture she had lived in for 9 years. How it felt from this side of it was something she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Something quieter and more permanent. High recognition, by herself, of herself, finally. She shifted back, looked at the assembled pack. All of them, their heads lowered, their postures changed, the political architecture of this place reorganizing itself around the new reality in real time. "My father was alpha of these lands," she said. Her voice was level. "My parents were murdered for this territory. I have documentation, I have the blood claim, and I have just demonstrated that I have the wolf to back it." Silence. Then one by one, wolves lowered themselves to one knee. Alpha. The word moved through the clearing like weather, like something that had always been true and had just finally been said out loud. What remains? She did not take Darius's life. This surprised people. Enough of them asked indirectly, him in the days that followed, in the careful phrasing of pack mates trying to read the new alpha's position without revealing their own, that she addressed it in the first formal pack gathering after the challenge. "He will be exiled," Darius, she said, "not executed. He will leave these lands and not return, and the terms of that exile will be enforced. If he violates them, the consequences change. But I am not going to build what comes next on what came before. This pack has had enough of people in power demonstrating what they could destroy. I intend to demonstrate something else." She could see them deciding whether to believe it. She let them decide. Trust, she had learned, was not commanded but demonstrated. She had time to demonstrate it. Because she was 20 years old and the rightful alpha of a territory with actual resources. Her parents' lands had been good lands, she discovered, as she worked through the documentation. And she had, in the weeks following the challenge, a great deal of work to organize. She was good at work. She had been practicing invisibly for 9 years. The pack reorganized itself around her with the adaptive efficiency of wolves who understand that hierarchy is structure and structure is survival. And a strong alpha is worth more than any argument about whether the strong alpha was who you'd expected. She was not who any of them had expected. She was learning not to care about that. What she had more difficulty not caring about was the absence that lived in her chest. She had named it now, not to anyone else, just to herself, and in the privacy of her own thoughts. The tooth socket hollow of the bond that had been and then hadn't been, and was still somehow present in its absence. A ghost of a connection that wouldn't quite leave. She kept herself busy enough that she could almost forget it during daylight hours. At night, she was less successful at forgetting. She wondered what they were doing, whether Seraphine's fabricated bond was holding, whether the council had managed to construct a reality out of the false marks that everyone had decided to accept. She thought about Kale's face when he'd watched her pack her things, that barely contained storm, and about the particular quality of Caden's stillness, like a river whose apparent calm is misleading about the current. She told herself it was over. She told herself with great regularity and thoroughness. See, she was telling herself this very diligently one morning about 6 weeks after her return, when the scouts posted at her northern border came running. The King's return. The scouts were experienced wolves, good wolves carefully chosen from the pack members who had impressed her in the weeks since the challenge. They did not rattle easily. They were rattled. 2 men, alpha, at the northern edge. They came without escort, without announcement. What do they look like? The scout's expression said everything before his words did. They looked like kings. She let them through. She received them in the Great Hall because it was the appropriate space for receiving visitors of rank, and because she needed the structure of a formal setting to manage whatever was about to happen in her chest. They came in. Cal first. Waz always. That ambient authority preceding him like weather. Caden a half-step behind, both of them scanning the hall with the practiced, comprehensive glance of men who have walked into uncertain situations before and have learned to account for every variable. Both of them, when their eyes found her, stopping. She was sitting in the alpha seat, her seat, rightfully, finally, wearing practical clothes and the expression she had been cultivating since returning. The one that said alpha and meant it. Her silver eyes met theirs without flinching. She watched them register what she was, what she had become. She watched Kale's control slip, very briefly, the storm breaking through for just a moment before he recovered it. She watched Caden exhale like a man who has been holding his breath for 6 weeks. She waited. Kyle spoke first. When he came forward and he stopped 3 feet from where she sat, and he did something she had never expected to see from a Lycan King. He lowered his head, not bowing, a wolf's gesture, something older than bowing. "We made a mistake," he said quietly. "You made several." "Yes. We never stopped looking for you," Caden said from behind his brother. "The moment you left, we started. We have been—" "Caden, she should know." "She knows." Caden stopped. The brothers exchanged a glance. Then Caden came forward too, and lowered his head in the same gesture. She looked at them. Both of them, heads lowered, the twin rulers of the Lycan Empire, in the great hall of a pack that 6 weeks ago had thought she was minimal. The tooth socket hollow ached. "I told you not to make promises you couldn't keep," she said. "We made no promises," Kyle said. "Hunt, we just came." She sat with that for a moment. "Why?" He raised his head. His eyes met hers. And she saw, without any of the control or the containment, exactly what she was to him. "Because you are everything we know ourselves to be when we are near you, and everything we are not when we are not. And we are done pretending that a council's verdict or a fabricated bond or our own cowardice in not fighting harder for you matters more than that. The hall was very quiet. Fabricated, she said. You know about Seraphine. We found the practitioner she hired. It took us 6 weeks and considerable resources. But yes, we know. The council has been informed. With evidence, it is being handled. She looked at them for a long time. Then she said, You should know that I'm not the same person you sent away. No, Cal agreed, with the expression of someone looking at something extraordinary. You are considerably more. I have a pact to run, a territory to rebuild. I cannot simply, we know, we're not asking you to leave. This surprised her enough that it showed on her face. We are asking, Caden said carefully, if we can stay. She looked at both of them, the twin Lycan Kings in her hall, asking. The hollow space stirred, not hollow, something warm and patient, that had apparently decided it was willing to wait as long as necessary, and was quietly thrilled to find the wait was over. There's something you should know, she said, before you decide this is the conversation you want to be having. They waited. My wolf is dying, she said simply. Whatever happened when the marks vanished, the bond being formed and then severed or denied. I don't know the technical term. It did something. My wolf is fading. I can still shift, but each time it costs more. The pack healer estimates I have weeks, perhaps a moon, before the fade becomes permanent. Silence, then Kyle. We know. She stared at him. We know, he said again, and we know the cure. We came because there is a ritual, old magic, the kind written in the first Lycan texts, that can reverse the fade, but it requires a price that we could not offer without your consent, a sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice? The brothers looked at each other. It was Caden who spoke, and his voice was steady and clear and utterly without hesitation. One of us must give up our wolf, permanently. The sacrifice of a Lycan's wolf nature feeds the ritual and reverses the fade. But once given, and it cannot be undone. The silence that followed was very heavy. Absolutely not, she said. The ultimate choice. The argument lasted 3 hours. She was very good at arguing. She had spent 9 years keeping her arguments internal and carefully managed, which meant that when she finally let them out, they were thorough and precise and built for endurance. They were better at it. They were 340 years old combined, which gave them a considerable advantage in terms of practice patience. She tried every angle. She tried the practical angle. A Lycan without his wolf nature was a significantly diminished power in political terms, and the empire needed its kings at full strength. They acknowledged this and said it was less important than she was. If she tried the moral angle, she would not accept that kind of sacrifice. It wasn't a price she was willing to have paid on her behalf. They said it was not her decision to make about their wolves. She tried the logical angle. There must be another way. Had the scholars looked thoroughly? Had every archive been searched? They had searched. 6 weeks of searching because they had known what she was dealing with before she told them. 6 weeks of combing through Lycan archives that stretched back to the founding of the empire. The ritual was the only way. I'm not letting you do this, she said for what was at least the 6th time. You don't have veto authority over our choices, Cal said, not unkindly, just factually. I have. You are our mate, not our keeper. Might we decide what we sacrifice for the people we love? She opened her mouth, closed it. Love. He had said it very simply, without weight or prelude, the way people say true things. This is not, she tried again. This conversation is not over. It doesn't need to be over, Caden said. We're not going anywhere. That was when the howling started. It came from all directions at once. A discordant, frantic wave of warning howls that hit them all like cold water. In the 3 seconds it took them to process and move, the hall doors burst open and a blood-streaked border wolf dropped to his knees at the entrance. Alpha! His voice was ragged. The northern tree line. Rogues. Hundreds. Armed. They're not stopping at the border. The 3 of them looked at each other. Or the argument dissolved in the way that arguments always dissolve when reality becomes immediate. Ritual later, Alina said. Agreed, said Kale. They went to war together. The night battle. She had fought before, not like this. The rogues came through the northern tree line in a wave, torches in some hands, the feral coordination of a group that had been organized for this specific purpose rather than the chaotic scatter of opportunist raiders. Someone had directed this. Someone had planned it, timed it, aimed it with precision at exactly the moment she was occupied with the kings, and her attention was divided. She shifted before she'd finished giving orders to the pack's warriors. Let the shift carry the final instructions, encoded in the howl that accompanied it, in the alpha frequency that her wolves would feel in their spines and respond to before their conscious minds had parsed the sound. Then she ran, fighting as the silver wolf was different from how she'd imagined it would be in those brief moments when she'd allowed herself to imagine it. She had thought it would feel like power, and it did, but power wasn't the primary sensation. The primary sensation was clarity. Like the world resolved into sharper focus when she ran on four legs, the noise became pattern, the chaos became readable. She knew where to be at every moment. Kyle fought like force, direct, tremendous, overwhelming. He moved through the rogues like a storm front, not graceful exactly, but inevitable in the way that weather is inevitable. His wolf was massive and dark, and it hit things with the full commitment of something that had decided. Caden fought like water. He was everywhere that Kyle wasn't, filling gaps, redirecting, appearing at precisely the point where the situation most needed him. If Kale was the storm, Caden was the tide, quieter but equally total, pulling everything with him as he moved. Between them, they were extraordinary. The rogues were not losing as quickly as she'd hoped, because the rogues had been told something. She caught it in fragments. A word a howl translated, the alpha is weak. The alpha's wolf is dying. Break the pack, and she falls. Someone had given them intelligence. Someone had timed this attack to the exact window where she was most vulnerable. She understood who, approximately 30 seconds before she saw her. Seraphine walked out of the northern tree line with the unhurried confidence of someone who has arranged the scenery and is arriving to witness the performance. She was not in wolf form. She was wearing the kind of clothes that required no shifting, practical and dark. And in her hand was something that Alina's wolf recognized before her mind did. The deep, bone-level recognition of a threat that lives below rational thought. A binding stone. Very old. The kind of thing that shouldn't exist outside of archives. "Hello," Seraphine said over the sounds of battle. Her voice was perfectly level. "You've become considerably more interesting than you were. How much did you pay them?" "The rogues? Enough. They were motivated by more than money as it happens. You've made enemies in your 6 weeks of playing alpha. People who thought the old pack order suited them better." She circled. Seraphine moved with her, keeping the same distance. "The binding stone is for me," Alina said, not a question. "It will slow the wolf until the fade takes it. I imagine it's unpleasant, but it will be fast. And then the question of who the Lycan Kings are bonded to becomes permanently, tidally settled. The fabricated bond. It holds very well, actually. The practitioner was excellent. As long as there is no competing claim." "There is a competing claim," Alina said. "There is a very clear competing claim. You've just been hoping the marks not showing would muddy it enough." Seraphine stopped circling. "Yes," she said simply. "I have." The battle was still ongoing around them. She could feel her pack's rhythm. Still holding, still fighting, but tiring. She could feel the fade in her wolf, too. The effort of the shift pressing harder than it should. The clarity beginning to fray at the edges. She shifted back, not because she chose to, because her wolf asked to be let back, and she honored that. She faced Seraphine in human form. "You're not evil," she said. Seraphine blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "You're not evil. You're ambitious and ruthless, and you've made choices that have hurt people badly, including me. But I don't think you're doing this because you enjoy damage. I think you're doing this because you decided a very long time ago that power was the only safe thing, and you've been pursuing it with complete focus ever since. And you're genuinely afraid of what happens if you don't get it. A long pause. That, Seraphine said carefully, is a very generous reading of the situation. Maybe, but if I'm wrong, use the stone. And if I'm right, she held out her hand, then we can find a different way through this. The binding stone pulsed in Seraphine's grip. The battle sounds around them were shifting, the rogues losing coordination as pack wolves and twin Lycans pressed them back. Seraphine looked at the extended hand for a very long moment. Then she looked at Alina's face, with the expression of someone doing very rapid and uncomfortable recalculation. If I lower the stone, she said quietly, the bond fabrication is fully exposed. I have nothing. You have your life, your freedom, and if you want it, I am not interested in punishment for its own sake. Potentially a path forward that doesn't involve ending mine. Another pause. Longer. The stone lowered. Not all the way. Not trust, not yet. But a beginning of the direction of trust, which was enough. The rogues broke 20 minutes later. The night battle of Midnight Ridge ended, and it would be told afterward in the way of stories that grow with each telling. But the core of it was simple. 3 wolves, 1 destiny, and a choice made instead of a stone thrown. The ritual. The fade accelerated after the battle. She had known it might. Shifting against the fade, fighting with it. The healers had warned her this would push whatever timeline remained. She had fought anyway, because the pack had needed her wolf, and she had given it. But the morning after the battle, she shifted and felt, for the first time, the wolf resist. Not in the way of an unwilling wolf. Nothing like that. Nothing adversarial. And more like a candle in wind, flickering, guttering, struggling to hold. She told the kings that evening. They had all 3 been in quiet company for most of the day. An exhausted peace that felt different from the silences of before. Something had changed the night before. Something about fighting together, making choices together, had settled into a new shape between them. She told them, and she watched their faces. And then she said, before either of them could speak, I'm not going to stop you doing the ritual. If you've decided, and you understand fully what you're deciding, I won't argue anymore. But I need something from you first. Name it, Kyle said immediately. I need to understand what I am. What my wolf is, really. Because a wolf doesn't develop the way mine did. Suppressed for years, and then erupting fully, without there being something underneath that I don't have the history to explain. I am not a normal Omega who turned out to be an Alpha. I'm something else. And before you sacrifice half of what you are for me, I need to know what you're actually sacrificing for. They looked at each other. Then Kale reached into his coat and produced a folded document. Old. Very old. The paper had the particular quality of things that have been carefully preserved because someone decided, a long time ago, that they might matter someday. He placed it in her hands. This came from the oldest Lycan archives. Our head archivist found it 6 weeks ago, in the same search where we found the ritual. We have been trying to decide how to tell you. She unfolded it. The language was old. Old enough that she had to work at it. Old enough that several words had no modern equivalents. But the meaning assembled itself regardless, rising out of the archaic phrasing like faces rising out of water. The moon goddess, a pact. The Lycan Kings, not these kings, the first kings, the originals, the ones who had knelt before her light 3 centuries ago, and a promise made about what would come after them. What would come when the bloodlines had woven themselves through enough generations that a convergence became possible. A mate who was not just a mate, a wolf who was not just a wolf, a binding of 3, not 2, the twin nature of the Lycan Kings matched by a mate whose own dual nature, the hidden power beneath the apparent Omega surface, would create not just a bond but a completion. A third element that the Lycan twin dynamic had always been missing. She read it twice, then looked up. Dual nature, she said. Caden nodded. Your wolf is not an ordinary alpha wolf. It is something older. The scholars think, and the old texts support this, that your mother's bloodline carried a Lycan heritage. Very old, very diluted, but enough, combined with your father's alpha blood and 3 centuries of the goddess's patience. I'm part Lycan. Distantly, yes, she sat with this. That's why the marks vanished. The human bond protocol wasn't sufficient, Kale said. What was needed was not the wolf mark, but the Lycan binding, the full 3-way ritual. It cannot be done in one night. It requires time, consent, all 3 parties present and willing. What happened the night you arrived was the bond recognizing what was needed and attempting it prematurely, with insufficient grounding. The marks vanished because they were real, Caden said quietly. But real and complete are different things, and Seraphine interrupted what would have been a natural development toward completion. She looked at the document in her hands, at 3 centuries of careful patience, at a plan, if it could be called that, written in the language of a goddess to play out across a timeline that made her own 9 years of waiting feel like an afternoon. The ritual you found, she said, the sacrifice ritual. Yes. Would the 3-way binding achieve the same result? For my wolf? Another look between them, this one longer. The scholars believe it would do more, Cal said carefully. A completed Lycan 3-way binding would not merely heal the fade, it would complete what you are, Caden finished. Bring forward the full Lycan heritage in your blood, which would change you, in ways none of us can fully predict. No sacrifice of a wolf. No, the 3-way binding it's not a sacrifice. It's a convergence, something given by all 3 equally, something created that is more than the sum of its parts. She looked at the document again. At the fire, at the 2 men sitting across from her in the firelight, watching her face with the particular attention of people who have learned recently the cost of acting before they understand. I want to read this fully, she said, all of it, and I want time to think. And then I want to talk to you about it. All of it, every question I have, before anything is decided. Of course, they said, both of them. In the synchronized voice she had first heard in a courtyard in the north, they speaking the word that had changed everything. She looked at them and felt fully, finally, with no hollow space remaining, what had been there since the beginning, herself, reflected and completed and seen. The ritual happened 3 nights later, under a full moon, in the clearing where she had challenged for Alpha. It was nothing like she had expected, and exactly like it should have been. Afterwards, she stood in the clearing in her human form, and she felt the Lycan blood in her veins. No longer diluted, no longer sleeping. Rise to meet the moonlight, and the moonlight rose to meet it, and the silver wolf inside her stretched finely to its full and proper size. The Lycan Queen has risen 6 months. The empire had been reshaped in 6 months in ways that 3 centuries of its previous existence had not managed. It began with the small things, the territorial maps, the ones that had rendered Midnight Ridge as a minor vassal dependency in tiny script at the southern edge, were redrawn. The Pact's reclaimed lands were formally recognized. The murder of Alina's parents was documented in the empire's legal record, the territorial seizure reversed, the lands confirmed as hers by blood and by conquest. Darius had honored his exile, which surprised her. She chose to take it as information about who he might become rather than who he had been. She kept the option open. Seraphine had in the end proven more useful than anticipated. Whatever calculations she had run in the moment she lowered the binding stone, she had apparently decided that a powerful, pragmatic woman allied with a new power structure was a better position than a defeated one. She worked now as a diplomat for the Empire's Eastern Alliance negotiations. Her knowledge of that political landscape was genuine and considerable, under terms that were strictly supervised and surprisingly functional. People, Alina was learning, contained more than the worst version of themselves. Even when the worst version had been very bad indeed, the bond was complete. She understood now why it had felt the way it felt. The overwhelming totality of it, the sense of a door blown open, A partial Lycan bond was already more than an ordinary wolf connection. A completed one was something she had no framework for and was building new vocabulary to describe. She felt them always, not intrusively, not a constant stream of thought and emotion that collapsed individual selfhood. More like a climate, not unlike knowing the direction of north without having to check. Kale's presence in her chest, dense, warm, the specific gravity of something that had decided. Cadence beside it, steady and deep and quietly joyful in a way that expressed itself mostly in noticing things. He had started bringing her small observations, a particular quality of morning light, a plant he'd found growing through the stones of the old western tower, the way one of the pack's wolves had a habit of spinning counterclockwise twice before lying down. As if he'd discovered, at 340 years old, the pleasure of paying attention to the world and wanted to share it with someone. She found this extraordinarily endearing and had stopped pretending otherwise. The Empire's council had required more managing. Like she was not Alpha of Midnight Ridge and mate to the Lycan Kings. She was, the scholars had confirmed, something the Empire had not seen before. The three-way Lycan binding, unique in the documented history of their kind, created a shared sovereignty that had no precedent and therefore no easy political structure to slot into. She was also, which had taken some adjustment, no longer technically human in the full sense. The activated Lycan blood in her veins changed things. She still appeared the same. She still felt the same. But the world had developed a slight shift in how it sat around her. The particular weight that powerful things carry, the way the air knew she was there. The council had debated her title for 2 months. She had largely ignored the debate and gotten on with the work, which was more effective than any argument she could have made. By the time the title was formally confirmed, Luna Imperatrix, the Lycan Queen, a title created specifically for her because no existing title covered the position. She had already reorganized 3 administrative systems, brokered 2 territorial disputes without bloodshed, and established a network of cross-pack communication that the Empire's advisors were calling, cautiously, revolutionary. She called it practical. She had always been practical. That was the surface of it, the visible architecture of a new world settling into shape. Below the surface, something else was moving. She noticed it first in the dreams. They had started 3 months after the binding. Vivid, specific dreams that did not feel like ordinary sleep mind wandering. Dreams of a forest that wasn't any forest she had walked in. Dreams of an enormous wolf, silver as hers but vast, vastly older, with eyes that contained what stars look like when you're close enough to see the fire in them. Dreams of a voice that wasn't speaking language but was somehow entirely comprehensible. She had not told the kings about the dreams. She wasn't sure why. Something about them felt private, preparatory, like the dreams were information meant for her specifically, being delivered in a format that only she had the key to. Then 7 nights ago, the dreams changed. The ancient wolf had turned to look at her directly, and it had said, and in the language below language, the one she'd developed the key to, 5 words that she had been sitting with ever since. They are waking. Be ready. She had been doing research since, and quietly, carefully in the archives that the 3-way binding had now given her full access to. Working through texts that even the senior archivists had only heard of in references, pulling threads that kept leading back to the same convergence point. The binding, the scholars had said, was unprecedented. What they hadn't said, what perhaps they hadn't known to look for, was that it was also a key, not just a connection between 3 people. A seal. The completion of the 3-way bond was the specific thing that had been required. The particular combination of bloodlines and will and sacrifice to open something that had been closed for a very long time. Something that had been closed because it was dangerous. And something that was now slowly and with the patience of things that have been waiting for centuries, opening. She was standing at the window of the high archive room, looking north into the permanent cloud cap of the mountains, when Cal found her. He stood beside her. He followed her gaze. "You've been in here for 6 hours," he said. "I know. You found something." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Something that changes the shape of what we thought we were doing. Something that makes the last 6 months look like... She stopped, started again. You remember when you told me the scholars said the binding had no precedent? Yes. They were right that no one had done it before. They were wrong that no one had tried. It's been attempted twice. Both times were incomplete. Incomplete because the bloodlines weren't right, or the timing, or the will of the people involved. Both times it failed. And when it failed, she turned from the window. Nothing happened. That's the point. When the seal was attempted and failed, it stayed sealed. Everything stayed as it was. Kyle's eyes were steady. He had understood where this was going. But we didn't fail. No. A pause. What's on the other side of the seal? She looked at him. At the man who had said you are everything with the simple directness of a true thing spoken, and had meant it, and had come south without escort to prove it. The man who would have given up his wolf for her without flinching. She looked at him and told him the truth. The first Lycans, the ones who made the original pact with the goddess. There is no record of them dying, Kel. No burial account, no succession documentation, to no death recorded anywhere in 3 centuries of meticulous Lycan record-keeping. Because they didn't die. They were, the closest word is sealed, contained, at their own request, or perhaps the goddesses. The records are unclear about whether it was a choice or a necessity, but the seal that contained them was the same seal that the 3-way binding closes from this side. The room was very quiet. We opened it, Cale said. We opened it. Footsteps in the corridor. Caden, drawn by whatever the bond communicated about the quality of what was happening here. He came in and read the room in one glance and looked at Alina with an expression that was, above everything else, magnificently calm. Tell me, she told him. The 3 of them stood in the high archive room as the information settled. She watched them process it. Kyle's jaw tightening, Caden's gaze going inward in the way it did when he was thinking through something layered. Then Caden said, with the quiet precision of someone who has identified the most important question, the dreams said they are waking. Be ready. Ready for what? That, she said, is what I have been trying to determine. She spread the documents across the archive table. 3 centuries of carefully preserved paper, and at the center of it, the thread she had been following, the shape of what was coming, or what might be coming, if the dreams were what she thought they were. The first Lycans were not simply powerful. They were the source of the power. The original pact wasn't just a gift, it was a loan. The goddess gave the bloodline its strength, and the bloodline agreed to hold something in trust for her. The first Lycans were the holding mechanism, the living seal. And if they wake, then the thing they were containing needs to be recontained, or dealt with some other way, or was always going to wake at this exact moment, and the question is what that means. I don't know yet. The records stop in the places where I need them most, but I know... She stopped. Through the high window, the northern cloud cap had changed. She had looked at northern mountains her entire life, from the wrong side of them, from the south, from servants' windows and carriage bars. She knew what northern clouds looked like. These were not those clouds. These were lit from within, not lightning, steadier than lightning, and wrong-colored, silver-white with deep violet at the edges, pulsing slowly with the rhythm of something that breathed. Something enormous. Something that had been sleeping for 3 centuries and had decided now to wake. All 3 of them stood at the window. The light in the north pulsed twice more, steady as a heartbeat. Then it went out. Silence. Then not from outside, from inside her chest, from the bond, from the place where the 3 of them connected. A sound, or not a sound. A vibration, a frequency below hearing that she felt in her bones and her blood, and the Lycan heritage in her veins that was 3 centuries old and knew, apparently, exactly what this was. She turned from the window. Cale and Caden were both looking at her. Not with fear, with the expressions of men who have found their extraordinary thing and are discovering that extraordinary things tend to come with extraordinary complications and have decided that this is, all things considered, a life they would choose. Well, Caden said. She almost laughed. It was such a Caden word for the moment. Well, she agreed. She looked at them, at the documents on the table, at the north where the light had been, at everything that was coming, visible now on the horizon of what they had set in motion, vast and unprecedented and thoroughly without any map. She had spent 9 years invisible. She had spent 6 months learning what it was to be seen. She had spent the last 3 months understanding, slowly, that being seen was only the beginning. Now something ancient was waking beyond the mountains, when the first Lycans, sealed for centuries, stirring in whatever containment the goddess had built. Something that they held in trust, restless now that the seal was opened. An empire that was going to need to be something different than it had been. A pack that had been given back to itself and was growing into something new. And 3 people, bound in a way that had never been bound before, carrying between them the particular alchemy of what they were individually and what they became together. Standing in a high archive room at the edge of everything, she thought about a girl scrubbing blood from a stone floor, about the carriage, about the moment in a northern courtyard when a word had hit her like weather. She thought about how the moon goddess had said, in her dream, "You were never meant to choose between them, but you were meant to unite them." And the voice that had whispered through the light beyond the northern mountains, the ancient voice, the first voice, the voice of what was coming. The Lycan Queen has risen, and the war for the true throne, not the empire's throne, not the political arrangement of power between packs, but the older throne, the one that had been waiting empty since the first 3 centuries ago, had only just begun. End of Part 1. The Lycan twins' hidden mate continues in Part 2.